So, welcome everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Colin Heyman. I am a trainer in equality, diversity and inclusion, and do lots of work around various parts of that subject. I know Azim, and I'm also very active in the Jewish community here in Cardiff. Welcome everybody, a lot of people from Cardiff and South Wales and some people from further afield, Amsterdam, North Wales, Berlin. Some of those places take the same amount of time to get to, actually, North Wales and Amsterdam. But yeah, everybody very welcome and very good to have you with us. Many of you were there at our first meeting in December, where we started a conversation about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And in that session, we really talked a bit more about the history, about the tropes, the continuing historical ways that Jews and Muslims have been seen and been othered. So this time, we're talking more about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the present day, although it's still connected because obviously anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the present day continue those tropes. So the way this is going to work is Azim's going to talk about Islamophobia for 15 minutes. Then I'm going to talk about anti-Semitism for 15 minutes. And then we're going to have a discussion. And then after that, we are going to give you a chance to have conversations in breakout rooms in smaller groups so that you can partly connect a bit more with each other than is possible in a Zoom meeting, and also share your thoughts and feelings around this subject and around what we've said. And we're going to ask you to come back with a question. And so the last 20-25 minutes, we will be trying to answer as many of those questions as possible. I'm not sure how many we'll get through, but that is the idea anyway for this evening. And we're due to finish at 6:30. Last time, smaller number of people stayed on afterwards, and that may be what we're for another 15 minutes. So we may well do that again. Haven't asked Azim if he can do that. Anyway, we'll see when we come to it. I think hand over to my colleague Azim. I should say Azim and I know each other partly through work. And in fact, when Azim was working for Diverse Cymru, who I had worked for, was when the first idea of this was mooted, of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But I'm pretty sure, Azim, that in our meetings before that, at interfaith meetings, we'd already thought about it and talked about it, and that was what criticised it. But over to you.
Thank you very much, Colin. So yeah, just to introduce myself, my name is Abdul-Azim Ahmed. And I kind of have two things that occupy my day. One is I am an academic as a day job. I'm Deputy Director at the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK, Cardiff University. And I'm also the Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Wales. So as you can expect, both of those give ample opportunity to engage with communities, Muslim communities in Britain as well as Wales. And I'm also grateful for having had through work I've done in the past, the opportunity to meet Colin, as well as many of the other colleagues in this room. And I think it's something I really value and cherish, this opportunity to be able to have conversations around topics of shared concerns, to also address understanding, misunderstanding. And I think has always been a strong component of Wales in general, but also I think historically as well, some of the most flourishing and positive examples of societies we've seen have always had as well at their heart that engagement and cooperation. So I won't speak too much about kind of where we came from, but I want to share some slides. I was unsure if I was going to use slides or not this time. I did use them last time. And I think sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're a hindrance, but I'm hoping in this instance they'll be helpful. And kind of like a TV show, we're going to have a previously on. By which I mean, I'm just going to quickly recap some of the things I covered last time. We looked at some definitions of Islamophobia. This is a historic one from the Runnymede Trust, published in 1997. This is the all-party parliamentary group definition of Islamophobia, which is one of the more commonly used definitions out there at the moment. It's quite short, but also doesn't necessarily give that much detail about what Islamophobia is. And you can also look at one like that published by the University of California, the Berkeley Center for Race and Gender. And their one, I think, is the most comprehensive, the most detailed, but also the least accessible. And I just point towards these definitions for those who maybe weren't with us last time, but also just to start the conversation on from a point of, what we're referring to. And very often what we're referring to when we talk about Islamophobia, on one hand, perspectives, views, ideas, and bigotries, things which are maybe internalized and personal, but we're also speaking about things that manifest in everyday life. And last time I spoke about 3 dimensions of this. I spoke about it from the dimension of international warfare. So when we look at some of the more recent military actions in the world right now, there is this disparity in between, maybe not disparity isn't the right word, but there is a high focus on Muslim majority countries in terms of the military actions of European and Western countries in general. And I think this is something which does feed into Islamophobia. I think is quite important. Last time I spoke about a quote from James Baldwin, and he was speaking about Vietnam and the United States context, and he was saying, any society which is racist at home will bring that racism out into conflict. And I think sometimes this can work in reverse as well. When we have examples of international warfare, which are directed towards Muslim communities or Muslim countries internationally, that has an impact domestically as well. I looked as well at some of the areas around domestic policy and social injustice. So this is where we can look at things like economic disparity. So Muslims face some of the largest discrimination in the job market at the moment compared to any other religious or racial minority. And we can look at international crises as well. The Uyghur Muslims in China, the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, both communities who are subject to some very intense and very sort of heartbreaking levels of discrimination, punishment, and monitoring, which in some cases has been likened to genocide. What falls into genocide, what doesn't, is difficult always in terms of international definitions, but we're certainly talking about very repressive practices. And you can even use examples which are controversial, but examples like Shamima Begum. So the stripping of citizenship of Muslims who have committed crimes related to terrorism. It's a very unique form of punishment. We tend not to use that type of punishment really in even the most severe or intense cases of crime. But it does seem to be used very commonly against Muslims. Shamima Begum is one example, but if you look at the individuals who've been made stateless in this way by Britain, the list is predominantly Muslims in the last 10, 15 years, and a few exceptions being individuals, usually from the Cold War period, who were involved in spying or espionage. And we can look at the hate crime and vigilante violence aspect. This is the attacks on mosques. These are the sort of on the street violence, the slurs that might be used on the streets, but also crimes like the killing of worship outside Finsbury Park Mosque by Darren Osborne, something that took place a few years ago. But for those who were in Cardiff, like myself, and I know many others here, it was quite a shocking incident because the individual was from Cardiff. So this is kind of what I covered last time. I think it is helpful to just set the scene in the picture. But I think today I want to focus more on what the contemporary challenge looks like. When Muslims are speaking about Islamophobia, what concerns them the most? And there's, again, lots of different levels and places and ways in which we can look at this. But I think there are 3 areas, 3 specific spheres of the world we interact with, where Islamophobia is something which is encountered and is concerning, especially when they operate collectively. And those 3 levels are society at large, the media, and also the political world. So moving on very quickly, there are kind of polls and surveys out there which have looked at the way in which individuals perceive Muslims and Islam. And I'm a social scientist, but I'm a qualitative social scientist. So I tend to value and have much more weight attached to things like kind of direct interaction, interviewing, participant observation, the qualitative ethnographic kind of tools out there. And I'm always a bit skeptical of surveys, but I do think they're useful to give us a sense of the mood, sense of prevalence as well. And so these are some statistics which have kind of come out from different polls over the last few years. And I think they're useful to give a sense of how wider society perceives Muslims. So one of the interesting ones is about a third of people surveyed believe that there were no-go areas in Britain where Sharia law dominates. These are things very often said about places with high Muslim majority numbers like London or Birmingham. A fifth had negative feelings towards Muslims. A third, again, then felt that equal opportunities had gone too far when it came to Muslims. Just under half would be concerned if a mosque was built in a local area. A fifth, again, would be concerned if a Muslim family moved next door. A third could be concerned if their child was visiting a mosque in the context of, say, a religious education class in primary or secondary school. Just under half as well would not be willing to accept a Muslim as a member of their family. And this is one of the worst figures in Western Europe. So even if these figures, I mean, because I'm skeptical of surveys and how reliable they are, we could even, put a wide degree of inaccuracy attached to these. It might be half of what's reported, but it would still be concerning that these views and ideas are circulated and held by members of the public. And when you put that in connection and in correlation with the media, you get a much more disturbing picture. And I don't want to go too much into the media because I think for me, the media's reporting of Muslims is actually a symptom rather than a cause. That's how I perceive many of these things. But it's certainly true that there is a very strong and very well evidenced negative association of Muslims and deviancy, criminality, violence in reporting. So this is some research done recently, 2 years ago, by the Center for Media Monitoring. And it's dated by almost 10 years now, but the Cardiff University did a very broad study of published media and came to similar conclusions. There's research done by academics like Elizabeth Poole and one of my colleagues, Michael Munnick, who look into religious coverage in media more intensely. But I think the one thing I just want to say about the media reporting of Islam is something that it was kind of identified by an author called Edward Said a very long time ago. He said that when it comes to reporting of what Muslims do, Islam is only used to describe and explain a certain category of behaviors. So you have Muslims who are doctors, you have Muslims who are school teachers, you have Muslims who are concerned citizens about a new road being developed through their highway, through their local area. Muslims are part of the fabric of life, and so they will also feature in news and coverage in a much more mundane way. But the use of Islam and religious identity is only mobilized at certain points to explain certain things, and a very small part of what Muslims do. It tends to be mobilized to explain violence, especially terrorism. It's mobilized and used to explain deviancy, criminality, whether that's related to sexual deviancy or whether it's related to lower level crime and delinquency. And this reinforces this negative image of Muslims, this idea of Muslims as being a problem. And we'll come to that a bit more later on. But the thing I want to kind of turn to and to kind of give a picture of where I think the issue which concerns Muslims the most about Islamophobia today is the political environment and the political mood, and how this has actually dramatically changed even in the last 10 years. Certainly, I think since 2015 onwards. And I think the Brexit divide and the Brexit debate has been a really interesting case study for this, because within the British context, we've had this great divide caused by the issue of the EU referendum. And the kind of picture, if I was going to simplify it to an unforgivable level, would be that there is, those who are, focused on a more open and welcoming society, and they are in favor of the European Union. And certainly a lot of the campaigning for leaving the European Union, Brexit, by organizations like UKIP, was done by groups which are also very strongly associated with xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and sometimes very overtly anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia. So you have this kind of picture here in the UK. But at the same time, for Muslims, when we're looking across to the EU and we're looking across to the European continent, there is this rising tide of far-right parties and anti-Islamic parties, which are increasingly gaining footholds in the political process. So 3 quick examples of the kind of statements made by individuals from parts of Europe. The Slovakian Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, spoke about Islam having no place in Slovakia. Miloš Zeman, the Czech president, said that it's practically impossible to integrate Muslims into the Western world. The current Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, wrote about how, in speaking against immigration, that refugees, they weren't refugees, they were Muslim invaders. This kind of fear and concern of Muslims becoming increasingly sort of an aggressive part of sort of migration. And then we can look at the political parties gaining footholds in parts of parts of Europe. So the Alternative for Germany, and again, these are all explicitly anti-Islamic parties with anti-Muslim policies. So it's not just right wing or sort of from that part of the spectrum. We're talking about very vocally anti-Muslim parties, very vocally far-right parties. The Alternative for Germany is the 3rd largest party in Germany. Freedom Party of Austria is the third largest in Austria. Jobbik is the 2nd largest party in Hungary. The Party for Freedom, which is Geert Wilders, he's a politician with a long history of anti-Muslim and Islamophobic comments, is the 2nd largest in the Netherlands. Vox, which is another party with very strong anti-Muslim policies, is the 3rd largest in Spain. The Swiss People's Party, which has some of the largest seats in the National Council there, is also one which you can identify as having very strong anti-Muslim policies. So it's kind of rising tide, and this picture was completely different 5-10 years ago. But it's becoming established and becoming part of the norm that anti-Muslim parties are part of the political spectrum. We've had hints and signs of this as well in the UK, but certainly it's much further along in Europe. So for Muslims who are looking at the EU debate, on one hand, we're worried about the kind of shift right in Europe, while also concerned about the campaigning and the messages coming from Brexit supporters and those who are in favor of independence from the European Union. And you're kind of feeling like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And where is the meaningful alternative?
Couple of minutes left, Azim.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm actually coming very close to the end. And moving on, we can look at just 2 quick examples. On one hand, we can look at France. And France has, in recent months, moved in this very concerning degree of regulation of Muslim civil society. There was an ultimatum issued very recently on all Muslim imams, leaders, and civil society groups to sign up to a charter which stated that Islam is a religion and not a political movement. And the very debate of what is a religion, what isn't a religion, what is politics and what is religion, I mean, that debate is so precarious that a statement like this is purely there to kind of sort of regulate things in a way which is very concerning. And sort of France has also been establishing a National Council for Imams, so regulating the religious life of Muslims in a much more stringent way. And you can look over as well to the political leadership in the UK at the moment. And there's been real infiltration of very anti-Muslim voices within the Conservative Party, which has been a concern for some time. Boris Johnson's views are quite well established. His letterbox comment became very well known, but also he's written quite extensively on Islam and Muslims. In a book called A Dream of Rome, he went into a long essay about why Islam is literally centuries behind. And you can look at other examples here, which I'm not going to go into just for the sake of time, but is also well established in certain spheres, how well documented these kind of sentiments are within the political leadership. And the way in which sometimes this manifests, I think, very recently this became an issue. But there's been this exclusion from the Muslim Council of Britain from engagement with the government for well over 10 years, stretching across the Labour and Conservative Party and leadership. And something like this is very concerning because they're one of the largest Muslim organizations for representation out there. And the fact that the government refuses to meet with a kind of civil society organization in this way, I think is a sign of some of the worries. So just to finish off and hand back over to then Colin, there's kind of 2 ways in which Muslims are framed by politics, by media, and by society. And this is, on one hand, the Muslim threat, Muslims being potentially violent extremists and terrorists. and the other hand is the Muslim problem, failure to integrate or isolationism. And these are the two kind of forces really pushing at society right now, and are manifested in sort of the right-wing political parties I've described in that shift rightwards. So thank you very much for that, and I hope I wasn't overtimed by too much. But I'm going to hand back over to Colin now.
Thanks, Azim. It shows the difficulty of describing Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, or any of these things in 15 minutes, I think. And I know I'm going to struggle in the same way. Okay, and I mean, very interesting to listen, and again, sort of noticing some of the similarities and some of the differences between the two. Okay, so just want to start by saying, you know, there's not universal agreement amongst the Jewish community about some of the things I'm going to say. So these are my personal views, although I think a lot of the Jewish community would agree with. What I'm going to talk about first of all, and I'm going to share my screen, is again, I'm going to do some of the equivalent statistics around anti-Semitism, which is rather good because we hadn't actually coordinated this, but it is, we are looking at similar things. Okay, just share my screen. So anti-Semitism these days is a mixture of the tropes that I talked about in our last meeting. For those who weren't at our last meeting, there is a recording of it. So if you'd like to see that, just let me or Azim know. It's a mixture of those tropes, and some of it is very, as we'll see, is very obvious anti-Semitism, and some of it is what I think of as rather more subtle. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. It comes from the far right, from the fundamentalist wing of Islam, and I emphasize fundamentalist Islam, which of course is only a very small part of Islam. It comes from the left wing, and Israel, I mean, it's not just Israel, by the way, but Israel is particularly touch point there. But like any of these things, I also think that it's about all of us as well, that they're, you know, as we, Azim and I mentioned at our last meeting, you know, we recognize that I will have some Islamophobia and Azim will have some anti-Semitism. If we grow up and live in a society where these things exist, despite our best efforts, we're bound to absorb some of it. So this is a survey that the Jewish Institute for Jewish Policy Research carried out in late 2016, early 2017. They interviewed 4,000 members of the public, and they were asked to state about various statements. Do Jews exploit Holocaust victimhood? Do Jews think they're better than other people and get rich at the expense of others? So some of those tropes, whether the Jewish community makes positive contribution to society, and they ask questions about Israel as well. So 70% of the British public have a favourable opinion of Jews. 2.4% hold multiple anti-Semitic attitudes. Much larger number of people believe in the negative stereotypes and ideas about Jews, but don't realize that doing so could be seen as anti-Semitic. And over a quarter of adults agree with at least one anti-Semitic trope and may express a view that makes that offends Jews, sometimes unintentionally. Like I said, some of this is quite subtle. And interesting, by the way, to compare those figures with the stats that Azim gave. Levels of Jew hatred are higher than average among far right and amongst Muslims. Again, that's the fundamentalist Muslims. But more by the far right. And this is 2016-17. And I would say that I don't know, but I would say that has been exacerbated since then. Despite all that, the UK does remain one of the best places in the world for Jews to live. Hatred is among the lowest recorded internationally. So if those figures are better in the UK than many other places. And I wasn't actually going to talk much about Europe, but you having mentioned that, Azim, you know, Orban in Hungary, in one of his elections, really majored on George Soros and portrayed him with all the old Jewish tropes and George Soros taking over. So, you know, a lot of these, the same in Poland, I think, a lot of these as nationalist leaders very much see Jews and Muslims both as very much as targets. So it's quite interesting to compare these figures with other communities. So 70% favourable puts Jewish community in similar position to other religious minorities, particularly Hindus. Of course, the figure for Muslims would be far lower. Just 1% think it's acceptable to be violent towards Jews. 75.5% think it's acceptable to be violent against Muslims. The hatred of misogyny, hatred of women in the UK is 3 to 4%. So it's about the same level. So yeah, quite similar. One of the things about this is the way it has increased so much over the last 13 years. And this graph just shows that. There has been, you know, a real rise in anti-Semitism over that time. There's a little drop in the last year. That's because of the pandemic, and I'll talk a bit about the effect of the pandemic in a moment. But overall, particularly since 2013, you can see this large rise, and that's a rise in all forms and all the different groups that it's from. Just to show you the sort of things that I'm talking about, a lot of it is abusive behavior. Not much of it is extreme violence. That's this little pink bit here. A lot of damage, desecration, swastikas on graves, swastikas on synagogues or Jewish schools. The dark blue one here is assaults. So quite a lot of assaults. So there's a lot of different things. And you know, all this is extremely worrying for the Jewish community. Targets are very variable. So visibly Jewish people in public, and I think this is one commonality actually between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So the visibly Jewish people, and you particularly think of people wearing skull caps, yarmulkes, and the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community who wear the very different clothes. Those are the visibly Jewish people and tend to get it more, but also synagogue property and staff, Jewish community organizations, communal events, Jewish schools, Jewish school children on journeys to and from school, getting abused on buses and so on. And Jewish students and academics. Universities are a very difficult place, or some universities are a very difficult place for Jews at the moment, and very difficult to feel safe. So these are some of the sorts of things: eggs thrown at congregants, as you shouting Jew and throwing stones at them, a man hurling a glass bottle towards a group of visibly Jewish teenage girls. Hitler is a good man, good, he killed Jews. A visibly Jewish elderly man walking to synagogue, a white man grabbing his prayer book and a skull cap and throwing them on the ground, and these sorts of things. This is some of the graffiti. Holocaust is a lie. And lots on social media, and the stuff particularly people like Margaret Hodge have had on media is just absolutely appalling, both extremely misogynistic and very anti-Semitic. There's no argument here. Global banks are ripping everyone off. They're run by Jews. So just a bit about, there were 1,700 roughly anti-Semitic incidents across the UK in 2020. This is a slight fall from the previous year, and it's the first year it's fallen for a long time, well, for a few years. And main reason for this is because we've been in lockdown. Most of the times when the incidents were higher than last year were January, February, the summer. In other words, the times when people were out. And in some ways, there may have been an increase in that time. So this is just something, the Community Security Trust is the organization that does a wonderful job protecting Jewish premises, synagogues, schools, and so on. And actually have been working, I think, with some mosques around the need for security and protection around these issues. 2016, 17, and 18 are all the worst years on records, but there's a very different dynamic. Israel has not been fully at war, and this latest anti-Semitism is about the condition of Britain today. It cannot somehow be blamed upon anti-Israel hatred acted out against British Jews, nor can it somehow be blamed upon British Muslims, as some people might try to do. And what he means by that is that when there is a war in the Middle East, the number of anti-Semitic incidents spike very strongly. But these spikes are not related to that. There was a spike in 2014 when there was an incursion into Gaza, but since then, there haven't been those sorts of incursions, but these statistics have been going up. And that's really what he's referring to, is it is becoming much more everyday and not connected to Israel. Okay, the pandemic. I mean, a couple of interesting things about that. First of all, the nature of anti-Semitism has changed. So some anti-Semitism has taken the form of Zoom bombing, going into Jewish meetings and shouting anti-Semitic stuff. But of course, the other thing is that there has been an increase in some ways in anti-Semitism, because as we Jews could have predicted when the pandemic first started, it was bound to be that the anti-Semites and other people would blame us. And this has been going on for many years, of course. We were actually blamed for the Black Death in 1349, even though actually there weren't any Jews in Britain at the time. So this is a familiar thing for us, you might say. And also there's all the, part of that is rooted in the conspiracy theories. Yeah, well, the pharmaceutical companies are owned by Jews, which they're not. They're going to make lots of money out of it. So that's that sort of thing. So that's some of the stuff around the UK. I do want to talk a bit about the US. And I'm not going to say that the USA is particularly worse or better, but in some ways it is worrying. So people will remember the far right marching in Charlottesville during Trump's presidency. One of the things they were shouting is that the Jews will not replace us. So a lot of racist slogans they were shouting, but very much part of that as well. Of course, there was the attack on the Etz Chaim synagogue in Pittsburgh 3 or 4 years ago when gunmen entered and many Jews were killed in the synagogue. And I kind of think that echoes a bit the attack on the mosques in Christchurch. And more recently, we had a woman called Marjorie Taylor Greene, who said that based on research she had conducted, the wildfires in California were caused by a project to explore solar generators associated with an international banking firm. An international banking firm is generally code for Jews. This Marjorie Taylor Greene has just been elected as a senator. Actually, I'm not sure if it's a senator or congresswoman. I think it's congresswoman, but she has just been elected and has retracted some of this stuff, but not in a really clear way. And when there was the insurrection into the Senate building on January the 6th, there were a lot of T-shirts, and this was, I have to tell you, was a real shock to me. I'd not heard of this one before. A lot of T-shirts said 6MNE. This means 6 million, not enough. Absolutely awful stuff. So these sort of trends, I mean, we know that because of Trump, this sort of thing in the US has increased people. But it's not just Trump. Trump has allowed it to come out more and be spoken about more. A lot of this stuff was there before. Now, I realize I haven't mentioned two things in this country. And that's the Labour Party and what went on in those 4 years, and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. And I'm not going to go into them in detail because I could spend 15 minutes on each one. There really isn't time. The only thing I'll say about the Labour Party is that Jews in this country, the Jewish community, were incredibly worried about the atmosphere that was being created and what would happen if Jeremy Corbyn got into be Prime Minister, and that the atmosphere he might create where anti-Semitism was okay. And that is the vast majority of the Jewish community. Not all of it. There were people who didn't agree with that, but the vast majority of it did. And the other thing I'll say about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, I think it's really useful that there is a definition, a framework. It doesn't say what's right and what's wrong, but it gives examples. And because anti-Semitism is not known about so much, and some of the tropes are not known about so much, I believe it's really useful, and I'm glad organizations are adopting it. These are both things that I could talk about a lot more, and perhaps they may come up in the questions. So I wanted to move from that really to talking a bit about how it works, because I think it's very different. I'm not talking about so that there are some, of course, so Jews generally do have privilege. And by that, I mean that we're white. Now, there are loads of Jews who are not white. In fact, the majority of Jews in Israel are not white. And of course, there are some Muslims who are white. But in general, Jews have a lot of privilege around that. The thing is that this does not make us feel safer. And I'll explain why. It's something those who were here last time may remember. Generally, the worst examples of Jewish oppression have come at a time when we were relatively successful in societies. And so if you think about Spain in 1492, if you think about particularly Germany in the 30s, we were very integrated into that society in lots of ways, and doing quite well, a lot of Jews, although there were a lot of poor Jews as well. And so we always feel that it can turn at any time, and there are lots of examples of this. And part of this is that big difference, and again, I mentioned this last time, between the way anti-Semitism works and the way other oppressions work, is that all the other oppressions are about that group being less than. Yeah, so black people are less than white people, women are less than men, gay men are less than straight men, they're not as good. It's a big part of anti-Semitism is that Jews are better than, they have more money, they're in control. And that is a big part of it. And I'm going to quote you a quote from Deborah Lipstadt. Deborah Lipstadt is very well known amongst the Jewish community, and you may have heard of her as well, even if you're not Jewish. She is the woman who wrote a book about Holocaust denial and mentioned a guy called David Irving, who's written books, history books, and he actually took her to court for slander for saying he was a Holocaust denier, which he is, and Deborah Lipstadt won. She's also a Jewish scholar as well. But she writes this: anti-Semitism is a prejudice akin to so many others. Just like racism, an array of other hatreds, it relies on stereotypes and assumes that all members of the group share those characteristics. But anti-Semitism has unique characteristics that differentiate it from other hatreds. The racist punches down and loathes people of color because they are apparently lesser than white person. They are, the racist complains, not smart, industrious, qualified, or worthy. In contrast, the anti-Semite punches up. The Jew is supposedly more powerful, ingenious, and financially adept than the non-Jew. Jews use their prodigious skills to advance themselves and harm others. The Jew is not just to be loathed, the Jew is to be feared. So you can see from that, that is a very different dynamic. So I just want to say briefly, and I know I'm very nearly at the end of time, that a little bit about what people can do about it. So just 3 things really. The first of all, I think this sort of dialogue, as Azim said, is really important and can move us forward. And information is so important. You know, so much of the stuff that is put out there about Jews, about Muslims, is just so wrong. And by the way, it's always been a part of anti-Semitism is misinformation. People have heard me talk about the blood libel last time. You know, the conspiracy theories. All this is misinformation. So the more people learn about Jews and about Muslims, the better. You know, if wherever you are, and again, I'd say this about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, if it comes up, please challenge people and don't tell them off, but just, you know, question what they're saying. And a lot of times people will particularly say, you know, if you say, well, you know, there's a lot of rich Jews, people will say, not realizing that that's a trope, that actually is. So it's something you can point out to them. And I think the other thing I'd just like to say is we have to be careful not to compete on victimhood. You know, these are 2 different dynamics. They're both different again from racism. All these different hatreds have their own dynamics. And it's easy to get into this thing of, oh, my lot is worse than you, and that's not helpful. And yeah, I think I'll stop there actually, having gone over time also a little bit.
Thank you very much, Colin. I think I really enjoyed listening kind of to this side of your presentation. I think one of the interesting things, both as Colin mentioned, actually, is, you know, we've known each other for a long time. I think we've had some extensive discussions about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But I think in every instance, that opportunity to kind of learn and understand the issue from our respective positions is always present. And I think even today, sort of having planned this session with Colin, it's a learning experience for myself. So I think 3 or 4 very quick points I'll just mention just to kind of start us off and give Colin a sense, just a moment to catch his breath as well, having just delivered anti-Semitism in 15 minutes. The first is, I think, you know, the survey polls you were showing were really interesting, and it reminded me of a quote which I've used quite often. I can't remember who it's by now. It's a US comedian. He said, you know, people have understood that racism is bad, but they haven't understood what racism is. And I think that's certainly, definitely, perhaps even more true for anti-Semitism. People understand anti-Semitism is bad. People understand you know, the sort of seriousness of the crimes against Jewish communities committed by the Nazis. But I think what anti-Semitism is hasn't quite been understood in the same way. And again, here, you know, sort of one of the things Colin educated me on once was the blood libel, and understanding that helped me see, I think, some of the sort of concerns around language used involving Israel and sort of the ways in which Israel is described. I wasn't able to see that previously, and understanding the history of that particular trope helped me understand the kind of Jewish community's concern there. And I think the other thing, which I'm probably going to try and not to speak too much about, because I could probably talk about it for a long time, is sort of we talk about the far right parties in Europe, how they certainly focus on Jews as well as Muslims. And I think there's a little bit of a division that some academics have made between, I think, what they call the reconstituted far right or the reformed far right and the unreformed. So the unreformed still focus on Jewish minorities, are still motivated and animated by a very strong sort of concern for Jewish communities in their country, concern in a negative way, not in a positive way, and kind of maintain those old anti-Semitic tropes. The reconstituted far right, which is sometimes present, and you can look at groups like the EDL in English Defence League in Britain as an example of this. It's where they have focused on Muslims as being their key concern, despite having kind of links in terms of networks and people back to the old far right. And what they try and do very often is they try and mobilize other minority groups against Muslims to, in a way, sort of make themselves seem more enlightened. And that might sometimes include other Jewish groups, but it also includes sometimes Hindu national groups, Sikh minorities, LGBT groups. And we saw the EDL do that. They had various wings and factions which tried to make themselves seem more enlightened and diverse. But certainly it's just there below the surface, you know, even in these groups. And I think finally, just to kind of highlight this as a problem and a question to which I have no answer, I think, when the last election took place, I wanted to understand, and I did understand the concern Jewish communities had at Jeremy Corbyn. And at the same time, I wasn't comfortable with what alternatives were out there. And it's in a position where you're not sure what the option is. In a way, you're kind of like stuck again between a rock and a hard place because, um, I'll be honest, I couldn't quite relate and understand the fear Jewish communities had about Jeremy Corbyn, but I took their word for it. And I had to understand that, when Colin was telling me that, the things that Jeremy Corbyn was saying, his networks, his associations were immensely concerning to Jewish communities. When large Jewish organizations were issuing these statements, I had to try and take that seriously, while at the same time not knowing who the alternative was for Muslim communities, because the Conservative Party as it stands is not looking to be a healthy option, both in terms of their policy towards Muslim, but also in terms of some of their social policies. And so your kind of options back in the day would have been Lib Dems, but that's not a thing. You got UKIP and their various sort of new kind of breakaways, and it's a question that I haven't been able to find an answer to, but I will say that it's one that challenged me. So yeah, those are just my quick thoughts based on what you were sharing with me then, Colin. I don't know if you have anything that came.
Well, I'll reply to that and also talk about a couple of things in your talk. Yeah, I mean, the Jeremy Corbyn thing is very interesting in some ways. We didn't think he was going to force us to wear yellow stars, or that sort of thing. But the atmosphere in the Labour Party, and okay, some of this was to do with Israel, and I think that's for another session where we do want to talk about Israel-Palestine. But some of it was clearly not. So, Chris Williamson, they're all Trump fanatics. This sort of stuff. There was plenty of this sort of stuff that obviously had nothing to do with Israel and was just anti-Semitic, and has been there on the hard left, incidentally, for quite a long time. And so, yeah, it is difficult to explain, I think, perhaps for other groups, but, it's just the idea that somebody would be the leader of this country who would allow those sorts of things to be said and not act. I mean, plenty of times he said he was going to stamp it out, but nothing was done. Interestingly, I read a report on Muslims in the Labour Party. I think I sent it to you, Azim, and I can't remember it that well. But, there's a lot of Muslims as well who have experienced Islamophobia in the Labour Party, the report said, and that those cases have also not been investigated. And of course, that's partly what the Equality and Human Rights Commission said, is that the investigation mechanisms in the Labour Party are not fit for purpose. But yeah, that is what we were afraid of, and it made it very scary for a lot of Jews, very scary that there be that atmosphere. So in the same way, I suppose you could say that Trump gave permission for Muslims, or Johnson gives permission, for Islamophobia to some extent, because of his letterboxes remark. Also, I'd say, by the way, I think I said this to you, and I gave examples in the last talk, all the parties have anti-Semites in them. It just was so clear, and so there were so many instances in the Labour Party and nothing being done about it. In your talk, I mean, I was so struck by those statistics. I wrote some of them down. 32, so almost a third, 1 in 3 people believe there are no-go areas where Sharia law rules. That is quite astounding. 30% object to a child visiting a mosque. We have people visiting our synagogue, and we do school visits. I mean, not at the moment, obviously, all the time, and that is so useful for us. And I've been on parties visiting mosques as well. So I have to say I'm quite shocked by those statistics. And yeah, I think there's a different level in those sorts of things.
And I think the scary thing is that I'm sure if I met some of these people on the street, I probably have. They're friendly, they're polite, and I imagine they have no particularly strong animosity towards me. But they're there, and I think that's also part of the concern in a way. I know sort of some of the black radical voices in the US have written about this, and Malcolm X, I think, put it very well in his biography, autobiography. That there are those who sort of wish you ill, and they tell you they wish you ill, And there are those who think they mean you well or don't seem or explicitly to have any animosity towards you, but would still throw their lot in essentially with anything that might harm you, policy-wise and politician-wise. And it's certainly that area, that kind of grey area of people who are friendly on the streets but have these views, and it creates a challenge because it's requiring now at this stage a very great cultural shift to try and address them. And it's losing ground. I'm sure things were better 20 years ago statistically on these issues, but it's certainly losing ground. So not only do we have to address the problem as it is, but we're constantly falling backwards in a way of on this challenge of public opinion.
Well, I don't know the stats, but I'm not sure. I'm a bit more optimistic than you on that, I have to say. I think a lot of this stuff was there, and the various things that have happened in the last 5-10 years, the populism has allowed people to express it more. There is a huge divide between older people and younger people, I think. Younger people. I mean, I was brought up in a white middle-class area of London. I didn't know any different people at all. And, my nephews who are brought up in the same area have much more diverse friends. And but I do agree with you to some extent. I mean, I think it's one of the big challenges I see for us as a country, and I say this as a diversity and inclusion trainer. I'm looking at my colleague who's a diversity and inclusion trainer, as I say this, Marilyn. But one of the big challenges is that we have to get away from this idea that there are anti-Semites who are bad people and non-anti-Semites who are good people. That there are Islamophobes who are bad people and people who don't have any Islamophobia who are good people. And the same with racism. I mean, this whole thing about Meghan Markle and the palace, of course, the royal family has some racism in it. They're elderly, they're white, they've been brought up in a fairly sheltered. That doesn't mean they're bad people, though. We have to get to, and I feel very strongly, we have to get to a point where, as you and I did, we acknowledge that we have some of this stuff, and it doesn't mean we're bad people. It just means we're brought up in a society where this stuff is around. And I see someone, a Muslim woman who's wearing niqab. It seems weird to me. I don't know how to talk to her because I'm used to seeing the whole face. Yeah, and I'll try and overcome that, but I recognize those thoughts, and I think that's a bit of Islamophobia because we're always afraid of the other. But I don't think it means I'm a bad person. I think it means I have a responsibility to think about those issues.
I mean, I think the Royal Palace example actually had me thinking recently because at the moment, I'm sure this is a generational thing, but I think the way I feel about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry is probably how my mum felt about Diana, which I never understood, but I'm kind of starting to get now. So I look at this, very young married couple, they've kind of made this big break away from the palace and been very overt in calling out the treatment of their son, the question of the color of his skin being made by a family member, and I'm kind of admiring that courage, and sort of my royalist tendencies are coming out. But what I found interesting is, on one hand, now I'm thinking, okay, well, with Meghan Markle and Harry, you have a very strong advocate for challenging prejudices around race in Britain. But then I kind of remembered not that long ago. I mean, we're talking about 10 years ago. He was in the news for, I think, wearing a Nazi outfit in a party, and also for calling someone a Paki. And so it's kind of like this is the same figure. And I kind of would like to believe that sort of the last 10 years of his life, he's learned, he's moved on, he's educated himself, and he's understood things in a way that he didn't understand in his early 20s. But I think it is as trying to recognize that journey people do go on, which can be difficult if you crystallize people's views. So in a way, I'm hoping sort of Harry can be a voice, but at the same time, having to recognize that he brings with him his own baggage.
Yeah, and I think in terms of our dialogue, that's a challenge for us. Is around those, for all of us, is to own up to some of that stuff at the same time as we're trying to have constructive dialogue. I think part of that is owning up to some of that. Okay, I'm noticing the time and think I'm kind of wondering about breakout rooms actually, because there's half an hour left, and in a way we really wanted people to be able to talk to each other a bit, so I think I'm still in favor of doing them. But perhaps just for 10 or 15 minutes. Really what we wanted is just to put people into breakout rooms of about 4 people each. And give you a chance just to introduce yourselves, say a bit about why you're interested in this topic, or what the presentations have brought up for you, either in thoughts or feelings. And please, in the breakout rooms, do a sort of, rather than having a discussion, encourage you to have a bit of a go round. Give everybody a couple of minutes to do that, to introduce themselves and then talk a bit, rather than just getting quickly into a discussion. And then we'd invite you to come back, if you can, with one question for Azim and me. And put it into the chat when you come back, and then we'll try and answer as many of those questions as possible when you come back. Welcome back, everybody. I hope those were good discussions in the groups. Be really good if you could type your questions into the chat. Someone from your group can type them in. Whilst people are doing that, just interested to hear from a couple of people just what it was like in the breakout rooms. Just a few words. Please just unmute and speak. Be brave.
I was in room 5, and apologies, I can see Marilyn now, so I know Marilyn was in there, but I can't see my other 2 colleagues. But we found we only had 25 seconds to come up with a question, because the conversation we had and the discussion about where we were each other was so involved and took up the time. And it wasn't just talking about yours and Amir's presentation. It was just
Azim's. Yeah.
Azim's. Apologies, Azim. It was about our experiences.
Lovely. Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, so that's helpful for us to think about giving more time next time, and you know, that sort of connection and hearing from each other is really, really useful. Okay, just looking at other things in the chat.
I see some good questions there already, actually.
Yeah.
Aram's question I thought is a good one. So, oh, sorry, maybe I'm misreading the question. It was from Fran, sorry. We talked about facts not changing minds. So our question was, how can we actually go about changing things? I think that's the question, right, Colin?
Okay, so you know, things need to be changed at 2 levels, I would say. You know, a lot of this stuff is systemic. If you look at the effect of the media around all this stuff, I don't have much power to change the media. Some of you may be in positions where you do have power. And, you know, if you are in that position, and there have been some brilliant journalists speaking out, you know, and contradicting the head of the Society of Editors, who said that the media isn't racist. So if you're in that position, great. Or if you're in a company and you have some power to make change in the company. But most of us, what we can do is influence people around us by the ripple effect. And I'm a great believer in one of my favorite sayings, which is the anthropologist Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of committed and thoughtful people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has."
Yeah.
Yeah, this is what I think you can do. You know, we can only do what we can do in our setting, in our area, with the people around us, but we can make a change there. And I'm a great believer in the ripple effect. So yeah, talk about it, inform people, challenge people in a constructive way when it's a bit different, you know, when you don't agree with something they say. Just to say, you know, finally, it's often difficult to do that. We kind of keep silent and hope it'll go away. One of my favorite sayings is, the behavior you walk past is the behavior you accept. So say something. You might not change the other person's mind, but at least you've said something.
I think that chimes in actually with the prophetic teaching in the Islamic tradition, which is if you see something which is unjust, you have a responsibility to change it physically if you can, and if not, to say something about it, or at the very least, to have hatred for it. I think going on to that question, I think I shared this anecdote previously, but I'm going to share it again, and I think it does chime in with what you were saying as well about the power of influence and the power we have it. But I went to a primary school in Cardiff where I was the one ethnic minority kid. I was constantly bullied and, racially kind of called slurs to the point that I didn't actually realize at any point that that was out of the ordinary. I kind of thought, well, that's what happens and that's normal. And it was only when I went to high school, and a lot of the same, we all went to the same feeder school, so we were all in the same high school. And one of the kids from the primary school kind of did the same thing. He called me slur. I can't remember if it was Paki or Curry Munch or something like that. And there were a bunch of people there who I didn't know, but there were a lot more ethnic minority kids. There were some Somali kids who were kind of in the school, a lot more kids from Pakistani and Bengali background, and it's quite diverse. And just immediately there was a strong reaction against him. He wasn't here to physically attack anything, but I think people made it clear that that's not something you do here. And my perspective changed suddenly. I was like, hold on, what was acceptable in one context was completely unacceptable, and I never saw that kid ever make a comment or joke like that ever again. So for me, I think it's power, and I think that's an uncomfortable word for some people, but I think power is a big part of it. The power to be able to censor, the power to be able to make a difference, the power to hold people to account is absolutely essential. And that comes through alliances and partnerships and working collectively, which is partly why I think this is important. I think Muslims and Jews, we do need to find our space to work cooperatively as well with others as well, in order to address these issues. So that's my kind of reaction to that.
And actually, Azim, that more segues well into Emma's question. How can we create safe spaces to discuss equality issues more without being fearful of getting it wrong, offending others unintentionally? So, really important question, Emma. Actually, it's what all my work is about. I always say the main aim of my work is making diversity and inclusion discussable. And actually, people like me are partly responsible for everybody treading on eggshells, because too much of practice around these issues has been preaching at people and telling them off when they get it wrong. And that is not a way to change things. I think it's partly about creating ground rules, although I don't particularly like the word, but creating a space where we get away from right and wrong. It comes back a bit to what I was saying before the break about, are they, this whole thing around the royal family is just completely polarized. Are they racist or aren't they? That's a yes/no answer. They either are or they aren't. And like I was saying, it's far more complex than that. And a bit like you were saying, Azim, so much. I remember Prince Charles, there was an uproar about 40 years ago, showing my age. No, not 40, 30. But anyway, at one point about Prince Charles calling somebody in his regiment who was a person of color darky. Now, I don't know whether that was okay or not. Normally, that is not a word I'd use to address a person of color at all. I think it's definitely not okay. But this is someone he served with, fought with, and these things are complex. That's what I would say. They always are. So let's explore the complexity rather than reduce it to simplicities. And the other thing I'd say, it's almost like when you have a difficult moment in your relationship and you're trying to discuss it, you have to get away from blame. Yeah, so yeah, challenge people that you don't agree with, but do it in a way where you say, actually, I don't agree with, but why do you think that? Rather than sort of saying, you can't say that, it's not appropriate. So I think those are just some of the things, getting away from black and white, and right and wrong, and seeing these issues as complex. Part of the thing that happens is that people want a right answer. I used to run race awareness training. I always reckoned that the main question participants came with is, what do I do when I meet a Muslim? That is a ridiculous question. It's equivalent to, what do I do when I meet a Welsh person? I mean, it doesn't have any meaning, but because of this fear, in a way coming from a good place, not wanting to offend, that's what people have. So let's get away from right and wrong. And perhaps I'd say, as a white, straight, non-disabled man, I'm going to make mistakes. Actually, so perhaps that's something else, is that to admit to ourselves we are going to make mistakes, but that's part of moving forward.
I think that's a fantastic summary, and I think it also describes how we got to this space as well, Colin, myself and yourself, by creating those opportunities to learn and get things wrong. I think there's a quick question I just wanted to answer from Jill, which is, does the Welsh government take the same approach as the Westminster government in terms of the Muslim councils? It doesn't actually. No, the Welsh government's got a fantastic level of engagement. I think it's actually exemplary, not just in terms of engagement with Muslims, but how it engages with faiths and creates spaces for, I think, consultation and feeding in. I think it's a world-leading good example that can be followed elsewhere as well. And I've not seen anywhere in the world which has the same level of engagement across the board. But it does create a different dynamic. And I think a key example of that is some of the policies around places of worship. In Wales, I think they've been pretty good. But in England and Scotland, there's a lot of dissatisfaction, especially amongst minority religions, and trying to address that. I think it shows the value of engagement and working with different civil society groups.
Love Fran's comment, suggested to me that we should be a drip on the stone. Thanks for that, Fran. Going back to the ripple effect, and we can have an influence and make a difference. Tony, I believe anti-Semitism is present across major political parties. Is there an expectation that the Labour left knows or does better? Do you want to say what you mean by that, Tony? Because I'm not quite clear.
Just thinking that Labour historically and certainly the left have probably done more campaigning in terms of human rights and rights-based issues. And one of the things that made Jeremy Corbyn popular with a lot of people is that over the years, he was anti-conflict in Iraq. We supported, we wanted a more broader dialogue in Ireland, and all these, these positions. There's a thinking, I think, on the left that they're much more rights-based.
Yeah.
So when they do mess up, when they do show, those incongruities that human beings do, then it's almost like, how dare you patronize us with your right thinking when you are such and such.
Well, that is absolutely right, Tony, and that was what Jeremy Corbyn always said. I fought against racism all my life, which he has. He has, and yet I don't think he got it. I don't think he would admit that as an older white middle-class guy, although he's fought racism all his life, he would still have some racist stuff. And I don't think he got that anti-Semitism has got a completely different dynamic and tropes and so on from black-white racism. And so, yeah, I remember reading, there's a very good book by Afua Hirsch, who's a journalist. She's really good, seeing some smiles from people. The book is called Brit-ish. In other words, quite, that's how she's treated because she's mixed race. She talks about Labour Party, knocking doors before an election, being faced by black people who are for the Tories, and finding it completely incomprehensible. We fought racism. Why do you support them? A lot of black people are actually really into some of the policies, and why shouldn't they be? They're small business owners, whatever their reasons, they're into that. And the Labour Party attitude is, how dare you? We're the ones that fight racism. I can kind of understand where that's coming from, but yeah, I completely agree with you that the Labour Party, and even within the Labour Party, of course, it's all about right and wrong. I don't know if there's anything else there that we should take up. And perhaps it's just time to, is there anything we've missed that somebody wants to ask us? One final question before we finish. Okay.
Colin,
Yes.
can I ask if it's
Yeah.
okay? I noticed in the chat they're saying this is the second session. Is there going to be another session?
There
Is this
is.
an ongoing opportunity? I'm just wondering about,
That leads into what I
promoting
was going to finish with, Emma. Thank you.
Brilliant. Sorry.
No, thanks. So yes, we want this to be a continuing conversation. And we'd agreed something, and I'm having second thoughts now, Azim. What we had agreed is that, so there's an elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet, a very obvious one, and that's the Middle East, Israel, Palestine. And we were thinking of making the next session, not perhaps exactly about Israel, Palestine, but about how what we've been talking about is reflected in Israel, Palestine. So, one of the useful things about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is that it puts us against each other. Yeah, and one of the things we always wanted to do this was because we always thought it would be so striking, just me and Azim standing up together and doing these subjects together. In the end, because of the pandemic, it's sitting down together, but there we go. So yes, and I think some of that is reflected. So that is a bit in the elephant room. It is what we were going to do. But I'm just noticing, how valuable people found the breakout rooms is, and wanting to do more of that as well, because I think that's really important. So there will be a third session. It is a continuing conversation. I feel like we have to do Israel-Palestine very soon, or it'll be the elephant in the room and acquire more and more size if we don't touch it, because of course it's the most controversial part of this. Anyway, the answer is there will definitely be another session, and I'm glad we did the breakout rooms, and useful to have your feedback about how useful it was. So I think that's it, really. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's really good for us to know that we're not the only ones thinking about these issues and interested in this dialogue to improve things. So really appreciate you all coming. And I'll hand over to Azim for final words.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think I need to echo everything that Colin said. I've really enjoyed this process. I've learned, but also it's great to see people kind of come and attend, and also some familiar and friendly faces as well. I think I've missed actually seeing people I recognize, so that's really great. So thank you so much for giving not so springish afternoon to us. And I hope in 3 months' time, when it's warm and definitely sunny, we'll see you again one evening to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Have a good evening, everybody.